Hello, I'm Eric, and I seem to have become an object of some kind of attention, mostly unwanted attention. I guess all attention is unwanted. Um, Over the last couple of days, because of a dispute about language, a fairly uninteresting dispute about language. Apparently, what made people angry was me mentioning the language Serbo-Croatian, and this is a label that is perhaps no longer so much in use in the world. The language that used to be called Serbo-Croatian in most places that teach it and translate it um, is often referred to now by BCS. That's an abbreviation for Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian. In some more recent iterations, they add Montenegrin as well. So it's a language that tends to break down into a larger number of languages. The question gets raised sometimes, is this language, two language, three, four, or a larger number of languages? And I have to say, this is a question that is hard to get interested in any kind of serious manner. It's the sort of question that produces debates that do not contribute to new forms of knowledge, to new understandings. It's mostly a place in which some varieties of nationally and ethnically justified feeling are played out, and resentments are played out. That seems to be what happened um, in this incident. If you want an answer to the question of whether it is one language or more languages, I'd say the answer is probably both. And I would refer people to the 2017 Declaration on the Common Language that was signed by a large number of linguists and other social scientists from the region, which says that the language that is spoken in the territory where the language used to be referred to by the label Serbo-Croatian or Croato-Serbian, um, is a shared language which goes by different names and which has multiple standards. That is, it is a polycentric language. This is a conclusion that people can agree with or disagree with. The basic point of the Declaration was to make the argument that the variety of language that a person uses should not be used as a basis for discrimination against that person in public or in private life or in state policy. But I think in order to go a little bit more deeply into this question, you want to ask the question of what is a language? And there are a lot of different ways that you could answer this question, what is a language? I will try to answer it in a sociological way and say that, first of all, a language is a category. And when I say a category, what I mean is that it is a way of grouping together things that share some similarities but are not all the same for the purpose of thinking and for the purpose of comparison. So, what languages tend to be built out of is a variety of dialects, habits of speaking, habits of writing that share broad similarities. This is a process that took its formal form for the most part in most places in the world during the 19th century, that is, during the formation of modern states, some of which were formed and justified on the basis of shared ethnicity and nationality, um, which included shared language. So a language is a category, and the interesting thing about categories is that categories are designed to be compared to one another, so that the category itself might not be descriptive of any particular instance that falls inside that category. Um, to give a crude example, in talking about things like ethnic and racial difference, we frequently make a distinction between black and white people, even though there are no people in the world who are either black or white, because if that refers to color of skin, neither one of those is a color that the skin of human beings comes in. So, what constitutes them as black and white is the perception that there is a difference from between the two of them, and and this difference then comes to constitute in states that have differential distributions of rights and privileges based on ethnicity and nationality, a basis of comparison. The way that you distinguish black or white is then law tends to describe some things that are not black as being black and some things that are not white as being white. So a similar thing with languages. If you want an example of a language as a category that does not describe its instances, think, for example, of the Italian language, in which there is a standard literary variant of the language, which is not the spoken language in everyday practice of nearly anybody in the state of Italy. It is probably more used in writing than in speaking, but each of the subversions of the language also has its literary forms. But the category is useful. We recognize the category of Italian. We recognize all of the various local and regional varieties of the languages fitting into the category of Italian. One of the reasons this matters in talking about national languages in Southeast Europe, I will show you a picture now, is that although we talk about national languages, the languages that we refer to as national languages do not correspond to the borders of countries or even necessarily to the distribution of ethnic populations in the region. There are varieties within these languages. So whenever we want to talk about, for example, a Serbian or a Croatian language, these are categories that have variations within them, that have commonalities between them. Anytime we talk about something as being Eastern or Western, or Serbian or Croatian or Bosnian or whatever, what we're talking about is not general practices and strict boundaries between the practices. We're talking um, about probabilities in using verbs in the middle of the sentence structure. In the Eastern variant, it is more frequently going to happen that the verbs are going to be conjugated. In the Western variant, it is more frequently going to happen that the verbs will be left in the infinitive, but both things will happen in both places. Uh, so languages are categories, and like all categories, they are mnemonic and heuristic in form. Categories are not and are not meant to be descriptive. The other thing that a language is a code or a set of codes. And what we mean by this is that, especially in spoken language, when you hear somebody speak, this provides information that is used to determine the social location of the person, where they come from geographically, where they come from in terms of social class, and and so forth. Language is a way of identifying people, and because it is a way of identifying people, it is also an instrument in building and maintaining different forms of social inequality. Sometimes also, language is a legal and a political instrument. This was not always the case. This began to be the case around the time that literacy began to become universal, and the development of mass literacy is a phenomenon that accompanies the development of modern states. I will show you another picture if I can find it. Uh, Here's the picture. Sorry for the delay there. What this shows in most of the world, literacy is now either universal or near universal. It tends to converge toward 100%. And this shows rates of literacy around the world from the 15th century until close to the present. The data in the chart goes up to 2000, 2010. And what you see, in some places, this phenomenon begins a little bit earlier. In some places, a little bit later. In most cases, the most rapid increase is in the 19th and early mid 20th centuries. The rate of literacy increases at the time that the duties of the state and of trade and of urbanization, all of these phenomena begin to expand, making literacy necessary. When it becomes necessary for people to communicate with one another and with governments in a way that is mutually understandable. If you go toward the beginning of this chart at a time when literacy was around 10%, 20%, then language, especially written language, was a matter for elites. What was the official language of a place was a matter of no importance for most of the people living in the place for whom other people dealt with questions of written language. It is when literacy becomes universal and when written language becomes the means that people deal with one another and with institutions, that language becomes politically invested with the kind of meaning and with the kind of association with identity that is important now. It's also at this time, particularly over the course of the 19th century, that you begin to see the development of so-called national languages, the unification and standardization of spoken languages and of dialects into a single shared form. So this is a phenomenon that happens in Southeast Europe. It happens in other parts of the world. Generally, what happens is that one of the many dialects of the language is chosen as the preferred one around which standards are built, and in some places more than one dialect is chosen, which is why we have languages with multiple registers and why we have vast differences in habits of speaking and writing in places where a language is diffused across a large spatial territory. If we think of global languages or languages that cover a large region, languages like English, like Spanish, like Arabic, very often different versions of the same language are not entirely intelligible to speakers from different places, or can be made unintelligible to speakers from different places. Nonetheless, we see these all as constituting a language. Now, why does any of this matter? To be honest about it, most of the time it doesn't matter. That is, most differences in language and most oddities in language, idiomatic expressions that are functionally untranslatable or that don't correspond to rules of grammar, are either objects of indifference. We use them and we don't really think about them or really care about them, or they're sources of enjoyment. We make jokes about them. That is, for the most part, for most normal people in most instances of normal life, language is a source of creativity, and language is a source of pleasure. When is language not a source of creativity and pleasure? It's when the diversity of language, when multiplicity of language, when the complexity of language, reflecting the complexity of social life in a place, comes into conflict with political goals that are unifying, that are exclusive, that tend to promote a certain kind of conformity, and then differences in language practice become a pretext for unequal distribution of rights, for unequal distribution of privileges, for unequal distribution of social recognition and of social honor, that is, for discrimination. And this sort of movement, the movement to cleanse or to strongly differentiate or to create new distinctions in language, is reflective of a kind of movement that we're familiar with in other parts of the world. We call these sorts of movements purity movements. And what is a purity movement? It is something that sees difference, that sees diversity, especially diversity of practice in social life, as a threat. It constructs it as an enemy. And generally speaking, in the final analysis, what purity movements tend to seek is the elimination of the threat or the elimination of the enemy, usually in processes that are directed against a particular population. Um, this is why, in the final analysis, the result of purity campaigns and of purity projects, of purity movements, of purity politics, tends to be violence. Uh, we've seen this happen, and we've seen this happen in the region that we're talking about. Um, what's some of the things that we can say about this practice? Um, One of them is that the goal of imposing uniformity and of purity and of establishing clear difference where clear difference does not exist in social life is bound to be ineffective because it comes into conflict with everyday practice. So as much as it is promoted through propaganda, It's inconsistent with the way that people act and the way that people live. I'll show you one of my favorite examples of this contradiction in practice. This is from a protest about language, one of the frequent protests about language and purity of language happening in Croatia. So here is the protester, and this guy with his very charming and jaunty hat is is holding a broom, right? A broom is an instrument that's used to clean things, so a symbolic expression of purity movements. And he has the slogan on the broom that is meant to say, Croats do not need the Cyrillic alphabet. But what's interesting about his slogan is that it is grammatically constructed in a way that is more typical of the Eastern variant of the shared language than of the Western variant. So he is protesting against a form of linguistic expression that is perceived as being mostly Serbian, and in doing it using a grammatical construction that is also perceived predominantly as being mostly Serbian. What this tells us is that purity movements in language, no matter how completely they are meant, are always going to be incomplete because they're inconsistent with what people do and with the ways in which people live. I mean, what this tells us is that all of these debates about language and whether there's one language or two language or more than two languages and so on, these are fundamentally not debates about language. They're fundamentally debates about politics. But if you want to say that language is political, you've probably made a trivial observation. There's nothing that isn't political, right? Uh, what what I think we want to do is to say that the politics that is associated with the development of language policy, and in particular with the motive to establish purity of language, is associated with a particular kind of political purpose. It's interesting that political institutions um, ended up being intermeshed with this little bit of unwanted attention that I received because I was just told this morning, my wife pointed this out to me, um, that apparently in the UK, the Croatian embassy decided that they would publish an angry response to my humorous tweet. It may have been a tweet with humor that didn't succeed, but all the same, she read this to me, and I looked at it and said, "This has to be coming from a parody account. Somebody is trying to embarrass them. There's no way that any professional and competent civil servant would allow something like this to go out on the account of a government agency. But apparently, it wasn't somebody making fun of them or doing something to them. It was them doing this to themselves. Um, I do want to answer one of the things that was said in there because I used a slang term in one of my descriptions of the set of responses that I got, and that is that I said, unlike the headline in the news portal that turned it into an article that said that Croats were angry. I said, I don't think I've made all Croats angry. And I said just a few Natsoshi. Um, this was interpreted as meaning that I was calling the people who were disagreeing Nazis. As far as I am familiar, the term Natsosh is it's a slang term, a bit of jargon that is used to refer to nationalists. Um, on this chart here, um, you see the frequency of use of the word and the other words that tend to appear in close proximity to it. Nationalist is very high there in terms of frequency, as is chauvinist, fascist, desnichari, right winger, patriots, ultra right wingers, and so on. Neo-Nazi appears on the list. It appears much lower. But what I want to say is that this is at least a partial misunderstanding of the term Natsoshi. Although, of course, if you look at the complex of ideas with which the slang term is associated, then it's not hard to draw the conclusion that nationalist and Nazis or fascists are ideas that are related to one another. And this is something that is the case in popular understanding, and also for theoretical reasons. It's probably not necessary to do a lot of exercise to show why. Uh, I just want to leave you with one more picture to illustrate some of this debate about language. And this is an image from a language textbook for children, for school children. And it is inviting people to participate in an exercise. So in the image, what you see is there's a boy there who is sitting and thinking. There's a thought bubble there, um, and thinking a number of things, thinking about what he's going to do that day and what he likes and doesn't like about the things that he's doing that day and so on. And then it's inviting the students. It says, underline the unnecessary foreign words in this boy's thinking, and then correct the text and correct his thinking so that he will be saying the right thing. Now, there are a lot of things that you can say about this little language exercise. You can dispute the idea of whether use of words from other languages is necessary or unnecessary or desirable or undesirable in one language. But I think what comes across here most clearly is not so much the particular details of what it is that the students are being asked to do, but the general overall situation in which the private interior thoughts of a person, represented here in text, become ground for external regulation and ground for external policing. This is what happens when political programs enter strongly into language. Um, and that's why it's probably not desirable for political reasons. It's probably not desirable for reasons related um, to language. I'll leave you with that. Thanks for taking the time to listen.